Estamos en orden. Wow. Muy buenos días.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so very much for being here today for this discussion, elections in Germany. What is at stake? We have the pleasure of organizing this session together with Elcano Institute. My name is Luis Rupp, and it is truly a pleasure for me to welcome you here today as representative of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation. Today is the day for World Justice for the 20th of, scheduled on the 20th of January. It was established by the United Nations Assembly to remind us of the importance of having a fair and more equal world, and to encourage us all to fight against poverty and unemployment. This date underscores social justice and common well-being as the ultimate goal that we must devote social efforts to and government's policies. And this is something that links quite well with our foundation. I'd like to share with you a few messages about our foundation that is present in Madrid, has been present in Madrid for over a century since it established its office in 1976. We're committed towards freedom, social justice, and international solidarity. It was founded in 1925, and this year we're celebrating our anniversary, and it's actually a 100-year anniversary, our centenary. We are a public entity, and we work towards strengthening democracy and reinforcing international cohesion. Democracy and social justice are essential pillars for peace at the domestic and international level. We campaign in this regard through our events and our publications in Germany, and also through the network of branches and offices that we have open in more than 100 countries. We're fully convinced that good policies arise from a deep and broad dialogue, engaging with all sectors of society at national, European, and international levels. We believe that justice, social justice, and well-being is the foundation for a strong and dynamic democracy. And democracy doesn't exist on its own. It needs care and constant effort for it to continue to grow and to develop. Democracy needs democrats. And this is something that was instilled in us by our first Chancellor of the Republic. And as good Democrats, we like to heed what people say and listen to what their concerns are. And to this end, we have recently commissioned a study in Germany entitled "What Dreams Move Germany?" And our colleague Catrina will talk about this during the discussion. You can actually access the study on our website, the website of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation, and outside too, unfortunately, and the study is only currently available in German for the time being. We live in volatile times. When we met with the representatives of our Real Elcano Institute early in January to prepare for this event, we already knew that the events were taking place very quickly. There were changes in the new administration of the United States. The war in Europe and the Middle East continued. There was a more dramatic environmental crisis, and there's growing populism and authoritarianism. But it was difficult to envisage such an abrupt change in the tone and the manners in transatlantic relationships as the ones that we have seen in the Munich conference, as we have seen in the Munich conference that has recently ended. It looks like a landslide. And the tectonic changes that we see here also delve into our connections, and European countries need to face up to very big challenges, even bigger than before. The European Union needs to take action, and Europe needs a Germany that can act by fostering European unity, a common response across many forefronts, not just in foreign policy and defense. The evolution of the German situation the economic stagnation, the blocking of investments, and increase in the voting intention to the far right is a concern for us, but not just in Germany. And indeed, the previous administration, in very little time, managed to push for energy transition. If you actually see the stock taken in the coalition government, the famous traffic light, as it has been called, the stock taken is not necessarily exclusively negative, but there's been a collapse, and this has led to early elections. From the geopolitical standpoint, Germany is facing up to the rounding of a circle. Can Berlin consider becoming distant from Russia and China, while the North Atlantic organization is also under pressure? These are some of the questions that are proposed by Miguel Otero and Pablo del Amo in the article that was published the day before yesterday, focusing on the challenges that Germany is focusing on. With this backdrop, we seem pressed to find the adequate avenues towards a sustainable society from the democratic, social, economic, and environmental standpoints. And today we're going to be talking about topics that are on the table before the elections that will take place next Sunday. We will be talking about the options and the potential scenarios. The dice haven't been rolled yet. The voters haven't attended the ballots yet, but we must bear in mind all the different options, and we shouldn't make our analysis dependent on polls, because quite frequently in several countries we've seen in the past few years that there's great discrepancy between the forecast, the prediction, and the real behavior of voters. First they vote, and then we start a potential discussion about the government formation. And we must respect sovereignty and be ready for the different scenarios. And this is the topic that brings us here today too. And I'm very glad that there's such interest amongst our audience and knowledge too, amongst an audience and our panelists too. And I'd like to thank our ideal panelists for today, Judith, Arnal, Miguel, Otero from the Elcano Royal Institute, also André Härtel for the Brussels office for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and our colleague Catrina Schläger representing also our foundation. And we will be looking forward to this panel in which we will dive in deeper into these topics, and I hope that we will leave the discussion with different perspectives, new insights. And I'd really like to thank the team of the Royal Institute Elcano for the organization. And without further ado, I give the floor to the director, Charles Powell, who we call a friend of the Foundation Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and we're very thankful for your support and your friendship. Thanks everybody, and thanks. I give you the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, Luisa.
Thank you very much, Luisa. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today with such recognized panelists, and we'd like to thank you all for your presence here. I'm very well acquainted with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation. I was very much in touch with the first delegate, who was famous in Spain, Dieter Konietzki. And in my past life, 30 years ago, I wrote academic articles about the role of the Ebert Foundation and its role in our transition in Spain towards democracy. So it brings me very good memories. We're here today to talk about the present and future of Germany. Perhaps we will touch on the recent past too. And you may be surprised, or maybe not, because we have a very well cultivated audience here with us today that keeps up with international affairs. But some may be surprised about why we are focusing on Germany. Well, it's due to obvious reasons that Luisa has already explained. Firstly, Germany is a great country, a great European democracy with great economic weight at the EU level and the world over too. And we will be talking about the different problems and economic hiccups that Germany has been going through in recent times. And secondly, because it's also the engine of Europe. It's a great economic and political driver for Europe. We are saying that sometimes it's not enough for the Franco-German axis to actually work well for the European Union to make progress. But at any rate, when that tandem doesn't work well, the European Union starts functioning well to a great extent. Also because it's a key partner in the transatlantic relationship, and currently that relationship is going through a prickly time. And also, finally, I'd like to bring this up with our German colleagues. According to the polls that have been performed, Germany is still the country that Spaniards hold more admiration for since the 60s because of its market economy, because of how well migrant workers had when they migrated to Germany in the 60s. Some of them came back in the 70s and the 80s. And generally because Spain has always looked at itself in the mirror, the German mirror, because of its democracy and its support to the European project. And this is something that calls for great interest. As we see, for one speakers, first we will give the floor to Catrina Schläger, who, as has said, is the head of the Analysis and Planning Department of the Ebert Foundation. Welcome, and thank you very much. Secondly, we will give the floor to Judith, who is a key investigator, researcher, for economic affairs at the Elcano Royal Institute. I no longer remember the name of my own institution. I mentioned it. Then we'll give the floor to Miguel Otero. He will bring in a different standpoint. This has been, of course, planned for. He is also an economist and a main researcher with slightly different ideas too, and we want to spark the discussion. Otherwise, this wouldn't be as interesting. And finally, last but not least, as we usually say, we will give the floor to Professor André Härtel, who is the director of the Brussels office of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the SWP, very prestigious organization, as you very well know, very well recognized in the world of think tanks. And I'd like to kindly thank our interpreter, kindly says the speakers, for helping us today. Our Spanish colleagues will speak in Spanish and our German colleagues will speak in English, at least initially, and then we'll see how everything flows and we'll take it from there, see how we move ahead. And now we'll give the floor to Catrina Schläger, and I'd like to ask you firstly about, in response to what problems or what phenomena are the Germans going to be issuing their vote? What are the topics that people will have in mind when they place their vote in the ballots? What will be the main factors there? Is it basically about the status of the economy, because there is a certain concern about economic affairs right now in Germany? Will it have to do with social aspects, like, for instance, immigration, which seems to be a constant concern for many of our countries? Or will the international situation also have US, the war of Ukraine, which is an issue that is not far away from Germany, the future of the EU, the future of the transatlantic organization? What are the main topics for Germans?
Thank you very much. First of all, of course, to Luisa, my colleague from FAS Madrid, and to you from the Elcano Institute for having me. It has been wonderful to come here, actually, because it's a beautiful escape from winter Berlin. Last morning when I left my house, it was freezing. It was minus 10 degrees. And when I came here, I really had to rush to take my clothes off because it was so warm. So it's really pleasant to be here. And I'm really impressed by this huge interest in the German election. And actually, that is also mirrored by the German population right now. The interest in the election is on a really historic high when you compare it to previous elections. But what we don't see right now in this election campaign is any kind of movement in the polls. So they are actually stagnating, which is kind of very interesting, because you would have accepted after the collapse of the traffic light coalition that at least there would be something happening in the polls and in the election campaigns, that candidates topics, policies, issues, and so on would somehow influence the election campaign and the polls. But that actually did not happen. So we see the lines of all the polling institutes, which actually hasn't changed that much since the collapse of the traffic light coalition in November. But to your question, what are actually the topics that are moving voters? I think there's a big discrepancy. On the one hand, you have a huge media coverage and a huge interest on the question of immigration, because we had 3 very horrific incidents with people committed by asylum seekers in Germany within just 10 weeks, and that affected the media debate and the political debate a lot. And when it comes to the question of what are the biggest problems that Germany is facing currently, number 1 issue is economy. Number 2, the second issue is immigration. But when you ask people what are actually their decisive issues when it comes to voting, then suddenly some other topics emerge. And on the first topic, you will have peace and security. On the second, you will have economy. On the third level, you will have social security. And just then, you will find immigration. So there is a huge discrepancy when it comes to what the candidates and the parties and the media is talking about, but what is actually in the hearts and minds of the voters when it comes to making the decision at the ballot box. And that actually also comes in then with the question, okay, how does that affect the final decision when they are in the ballot box? And we are seeing that we still have about 30% of the voters who are not decided, and maybe we will see some movements in the outcome compared to the polls right now, but it's not very likely, to be honest.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So there's an interesting sort of cognitive dissonance here between what the media is telling us is important and what a lot of average, normal Germans believe is important. Judith, you've been following, has estado siguiendo la economía.
You have been following the evolution of the economy. You have been following the evolution of the German economy up close for very years as a member of a think tank in Madrid and Brussels. And you're very much concerned about the situation of the German economy. This is something you have been raising for the last 2 years. Can you explain why? Well, generally, I'm concerned about many things because I tend to be a especially pessimistic individual. But allow me to explain why I'm concerned about the situation of the German economy. First, because of the structural circumstantial situation, also because of the structural challenges, and also because of how I see the potential economic policy of the eventual German government. Why are we concerned about the German economy? Because it represents 25% of the GDP at the EU level, because it has a traction effect. Whatever happens there has a traction effect for the rest of member states. So what's the circumstances in the German economy? We see the accumulated economic growth between 2019 and 2024. The German economy was stagnated, and this is a stark contrast with the fact that the Eurozone grew by 5% roughly. What happened between 2022 and 2024? The growth rate in the German economy was negative, and for 2025 it is expected that the German economy will be stagnated. The GDP would grow between 0.2 and 0.3%. And this is closely related to what has been happening in the Ukraine with the energy crisis too, because there was a sharp increase in energy prices, and the industry specialization of the German economy with a great weight in the manufacturing industry, which is very energy consumption intensive, that was impacted by all this. And in order to face that inflationary shock, the European Central Bank had to increase interest rates, and that had an economic effect. Now we see that energy prices have decreased notably, and the interest rate cycle is on a downward trend. So we see that things are starting to be a bit more centered, but we're facing up to important structural challenges. The first of them is energy. I said that energy costs decreased quite a lot, but even though they decrease, energy costs in Germany are double compared to what they were before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and they are higher than those of the United States. And this has an impact on industrial costs too. Secondly, the very model of economic growth in Germany that is supported by the manufacturing industry, and it's very much focused on an economy that is focused on placing those products outside of Germany, and that's taken a toll right now, mainly because of two reasons. First, because of the very specialization around an industry that is mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, that's to say hardware, and not really software, not really digitization related, which is what the 21st century seems to be all about. And secondly, because of how dependent it is from external countries. The main market where they price their products is the United States, and we don't even need to talk about what's going on in the United States. But another very important market for Germany is China. What happened to China? Even though China is presented GDP growth rates of 4.5%, 5%, which are good rates, but internal demand in China is weak. So they no longer demand so much those German products as before. And China is becoming a competitor for Germany. It doesn't just demand products anymore. In some contexts, for instance, in the automotive industry, it's starting to be a very serious competitor. And the third problem is that there's lack of public investment that causes private investment to be lower than the EU average. That lack of public investment on transportation infrastructures, on telecommunications infrastructures, causes Germany to be below the EU level in terms of some metrics. And that also at the same time causes a not so dynamic private investment. And finally, this might be surprising for some, bureaucracy. We always say that things were well in Germany, a Swiss clock, we say, but we should say that it works like a German clock. But we're quite used to thinking that things work very well in Germany, but there's some red tape issues that have to do with how it's structured in Germany. And this also applies to Spain. I'm sorry because I'm speaking quite a lot here, but we also need to mention that the German population is aging, and the forecast of the International Monetary Fund, they say that the working population in Germany will decrease on a yearly basis by 0.5%, and that is above the average of any other economy of the G7. So if the working population is on the decrease and the productivity rates are adjusted, the potential growth in the mid-run for Germany is below 1%. And these are the structural challenges. And this is how I see economic policy after the elections. I don't have a crystal ball, but if we compare the economic programs of the main parties, what we see is that there's great alignment between the CDU, that is to say the Democratic Christians and Liberals, and then Social Democrats and the Greens are quite aligned. The Traffic Light Coalition, one of the first reasons why they collapsed was because of the issue having to do with that, and the great differences between the Liberals and Social Democrats and the Greens on the other hand. And I'm sure our German colleagues are more acquainted with this than I am. Liberals will be below 5% and they won't have parliamentary representation. And this causes the CDU to have to reach an agreement with Social Democrats or the Greens too. And because of the debt break, the industrial issues, the energy issues, how to reindustrialize Germany, there's quite divergent perspectives on those topics. And your about the bureaucracy was especially striking, right? Germany is a federal system. We are an autonomic or semi-federal system with a multi-level governance at any rate, and that can offer some advantages. but it can also give rise to some inefficiencies. And then we have the lack of public investment, which at the same time has an impact on private investment too. Miguel, for many years, you have been following the German economy. Miguel performed studies in Switzerland. He speaks Swiss German, so he has the good habit of reading the media, the German media, and this helps you test the waters of the German public opinion and the discussion there. Catrina was also saying that for the average German, the economy is potentially more important than may seem if you were to just read the headlines. So what's your feeling about the discussion about revolving around the German campaign? There's been a few debates. This has helped you possibly delve deeper into the feeling that exists. What are the potential results as you think, and what are the potential outcomes? I think Germany is a bit depressed. We always used to say that the Spaniards were the world champions in self-beating ourselves and punishing ourselves, and Germany seems to be beating us at that. They are going through an identity crisis, I think, and this is mirrored on two key aspects, or maybe three, if you will. One has to do with Trump and with how that liberal world is crashing in a way. Globalization is crumbling for a country that's terribly dependent on exports. And with China, they're probably one of the ones that have benefited most from globalization. And this is it's one big shock indeed. In addition to the fact that Trump has some sort of rivalry against Germans. For them, the United States was almost like a protective father after the Second World War. And then we have Putin and Ukraine. The fact that a country can invade another country, and for that to happen so close to home, and for that to have such big costs, having an impact on inflation, energy, as Judith explained, and all that, that shakes society. And there's fear of a potential conflict too. And then we have the challenge or the threat of the Chinese electric vehicles against the German electric vehicles. Electric vehicles in Germany is the sign of the miracle, the German miracle after the Second World War. So all these things are being challenged, and I think that the German population is currently afraid of the future and afraid of the world. And I think a part of the German society is wanting to close borders, considering that immigration is something that is beyond, and that is somewhat of a challenge, of a threat. And this is what is causing them to want to control the borders. And since I started analyzing Germany, I see that for the first time ever, I see in Germany something that I've seen in other countries in the south of Europe, like Spain, the feeling that the state is not functioning, it's not working. And for Germans to say that, that's something big. Trains are not working, bridges are collapsing, there's excessive bureaucracy. So that is a great shock for the German society. But at the same time, I'm relatively optimistic in terms of the German economy. Judith was mentioning many elements about that, but if you're not growing, there's some sectors or industries that are having negative growth, but at the same time, there's some industries that are having positive growth. Otherwise, you didn't get to a zero sum, right? And there's some industries that are performing quite well. For instance, the Metrostud, which is the backbone of the German economy, considers that AI is a great opportunity for them because they know their customers and they think that, okay, software could be American made, but the application of software in the industry will be led by them. And then, for instance, job positions, and where there's jobs disappearing and some are being created, well, some industries are doing quite well. Defense, aerospace, and in coming years, there will be quite a lot of investment placed into the defense industry. And then also Merz said it, and he said something that is very important for Germany and for Europe. It's quite likely that the constitution will be reformed and the debt brake will be lifted. And if that were to happen, then Germany could start investing and they could revert that trend that they had in the last 20 years of ceasing to invest in public infrastructures. And I could go on. I think that the corporate model, that Renian model of German capitalistic, causes it to be a big petrol tanker that is difficult to maneuver. And as Judith also said, it looks like Germany was stuck in the 20th century, in the industry of the 20th century, automotive, chemistry, the heavy industries. But they're being much more efficient. If you actually focus on the industrial production volume, if you look into it, you see that the industrial production has not decreased. So they're becoming more efficient. And at some point, I don't think it's going to take very long, they will embrace the digital and technological world. They haven't yet done it, but as soon as they do it, that tanker will start churning, and I think it'll happen. And currently, Germany is the second producer of electric vehicles right after China. And even in that context, they're undergoing some sort of a reform. And the greatest concern, I think, is that with Merz, Germany can perform structural reforms, even change bureaucracy. They will step up their efforts, they will become more efficient, and they will go back to being like they were 20 years ago with Schröder's reform, becoming more efficient. China could continue maybe to grow, and that could be giving them a boost. And then Germany would support a model that would encourage all their neighbors to do the same. And maybe we may not have that fiscal union that we should have in Europe. Judith and I agree with that, in order to compete with the United States and China. And maybe for another 5 years, we will have to discuss whether we need that central fiscal or tax capacity, and that could cause us to be perhaps weaker in the face of China and the United States. I'd like to underscore that idea of those countries that are great beneficiaries of globalization, but they're afraid of the future and foreign world. I'm talking about a Klingendaun report on the Netherlands, describing a very similar situation, a great country that has successfully waged through globalization, but they're somewhat fearful right now.
You're in Brussels, the heart of Europe, or so we like to think it is. Which means that you can watch both the European Union and NATO at very close quarters. What Spaniards have generally believed, I think, about Germany and the EU, as I was saying earlier, is that the EU wouldn't exist without Germany, that German leadership, together with French leadership, has always been crucial in order to implement far-reaching initiatives, any significant reform. But admittedly, in the last decade or so, Germany has been perhaps less proactive, partly because Monsieur Macron is hyperactive, and it's difficult to keep up with Monsieur Macron. Not always to good effect, perhaps, but anyway, the point is, my question is, how do you see Germany within the European Union? Does Germany have a vision for Europe? What kind of Europe does Germany want? Or are you too self-centered? Are you too worried, too concerned about your own domestic problems, whether they are economic or social, or the rise of the far right, which we haven't managed to mention yet, which is pretty good. We've been talking for 34 minutes and we haven't mentioned the far right much. You did earlier. So is Germany, is this an introspective, inward-looking Germany which is reluctant to lead? Or do you think that once the elections are over, given what Donald Trump seems to be up to, that Germany will respond and provide leadership for the whole of the EU? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to the Ebert Stiftung and also to Elcano for making this very timely event possible. And thank you also for the questions. It's hard to say. If I have learned one thing as an analyst in the last years, it's that outside pressure is not always enough. You have to make the right choices yourself. And I think this is already kind of leading a little bit towards my answer, but to your question. But I want to make three major points. First of all, on Germany, the German elections, and German foreign policy in the future, or in the past and future. First of all, I am deeply convinced that the current lack of German leadership in Europe and internationally is first of all the result of a very strong and ever stronger misfit between traditional German strategic culture based on multilateralism, transatlanticism, a conduct based on the rules-based order and international law, and what we are now seeing as the post-liberal international order, a much more, an order based much more on great power conduct than on rules. So what we currently basically see personified by the policies of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Second, the so-called Zeitenwende, so the German term coined by Chancellor Olaf Scholz in 2022 in response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, meaning a decisive response of German policy towards this aggression, an overall change in the country's defense policy. It has basically given way, so it was supposed to be a turn, a transformation, Zeitenwende. It has given way after 3 years into the war in Ukraine to a much more gradual and non-holistic program of rearmament or military reorganization and some policy adjustments. Currently, this Zeitenwende as a political program is mired or stuck in a debate about policy trade-offs, first of all, between investments into defense and or the social sphere. My third point, the federal election now happening on Sunday in Germany provides German foreign policy maybe with a chance to overcome the personal and structural obstacles the current coalition has created to more German leadership on the European stage. But most of all, rather than the election itself, it will depend on the chancellors, on the new willingness to step over the shadow of existing policy axioms in German domestic and international policy conduct, whether Germany becomes a leader in Europe again or not. This would include reforming the so-called debt brake, to embrace and lead coalitions of the willing inside the European Union, plus the United Kingdom maybe, and the assertive construction of a European pillar inside NATO with the potential of independent action vis-à-vis the United States. Let me elaborate on this a little bit more in regard to the question of Europe or the EU as the prior policy framework for German foreign policy. In the last years, what we have seen is a very stark contrast between the Merkel years and accepted German leadership in Europe and the so-called German vote phenomenon connected to the current traffic light coalition. German vote here means that Germans take no position really, or too late, so that they cannot influence debates in Europe and cannot cannot lead or give an impulse policy-wise. Chancellor Scholz, need to be here as clear as we can get, has been unable to forge strong personal bonds, as Merkel did before, to other leaders such as Macron, and to create trust. What we've seen rather as a consequence of this German vote in Europe was German isolation. You see already informal frameworks like the Nordic 8 being formed without the participation of Germany in Europe, inside the EU, and even a foreign policy crisis of the EU itself as a consequence of the lack of German leadership. But the obstacles here, so the obstacles towards more German leadership inside the EU, are not only personal and structural, as I mentioned before. Most of all, they're due to Germany's traditional, ordo-liberal and very legalist bureaucratic approach to EU politics, which makes Germany not flexible or creative enough for the extraordinary challenges we face today geopolitically inside the Union and outside, of course. Friedrich Merz, the most likely new chancellor, has promised on the one side to win back the trust of partners, most of all of France and Poland, and overcome the German vote phenomena. So taking positions early on major policy decisions inside the European Union. But on the other side, he and the CDU, the Christian Democrats, overall are very skeptical of more EU-led solutions, such as borrowing for defense, or handing over more competencies to the Union in the defense portfolio. They are also quite skeptical of coalitions of the willing, because Germany traditionally understands itself as a supporter of the small and middle-sized states inside the European Union. And this is maybe the most difficult message to transfer, Friedrich Merz and his team seem to think very much in strict German interests, national interests, without much regard to the EU. So it needs to be seen if after an election, after the forming of a government, which will take some time, we haven't mentioned this here, so we could well end up with a government only at the end of April or even in May. It remains to be seen how much Europe will be used as an instrument, as a forum for German foreign policy in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, very interesting. Catrina, a great American, Benjamin Franklin, not Ronald Reagan, once said that there are only two certainties in life. One is death, and the other is taxes. There are two certainties in German politics, right, today, only two. One is that the CDU-CSU will be the largest party in the Bundestag. The other is that there will be a coalition government somewhere, sometime in the spring. Okay, that isn't much, I know, but help me out here. Crystal balls aside, predictions aside, the outgoing coalition was obviously exhausted, and people want change of some sort. We were talking about the latest polls. These are just polls, of course, and you know polls have become notoriously unreliable, but the latest I've seen predict that the CDU-CSU will win about 30% of the vote. The AfD, the far right, will win 21%. The SPD, 16%. The Greens, 13%. The Left Party, 7%. BSW 5%, and the Liberals perhaps 4 or 5%. So there's a question mark as to whether the Liberals will form part of the Bundestag. You think they will. Am I reading too much? You made a gesture earlier. You're not sure. Well, I hope to see the Liberals in the Bundestag personally. I think they always make a useful contribution. So what kind of government are the Germans looking for? What kind of alternative coalition to the coalition we've just had do you think is most viable? And tell us about the AfD phenomenon. One of the reasons why we're all looking at Germany, of course, is because relatively, in the previous Bundestag, they had, 10% of the vote? Now, who is responsible for that? The Christian Democrat leader was saying last night, I think, that it's the people in office who are responsible for that, not the CDU for flirting with the AfD. That's obviously a self-interested analysis. So how is Germany dealing with the rise of the far right? Of course, this is a debate that's very relevant to us here in Spain.
Thank you. There's quite a lot of questions. But I start with your first certainty that you rose coming from a social democratic institution or an institution that is close to social democracy. I of course have to say maybe we will see a different result as that you just proposed. It's not very likely, I have to admit, but at least I have to say that. Yeah.
Okay.
What is really striking about these elections is the high degree of uncertainty. It's, first of all, we don't know how many parties will be represented in the new Bundestag. Right now we have 6, that could rise to 7, because we have a new party formation, a split off from the left party, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. But the Liberals, the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, and the Linke, they are all struggling with the 5% hurdle. So, if they are in parliament, if 2 are in parliament, if just only 1 is in parliament, that will affect the coalition formation. If you will have, or if we will have a 2-party coalition or a 3-party coalition. Well, our experience with 3-party coalitions, when you look at the traffic lights coalition, is not a very big success story, to be honest. But it's unclear if it will, if even a grand coalition will be able to make it over the 50%. We do not have any kind of experience with minority governments in Germany, and I think that's very unlikely that this would actually will happen. And if you look at the different options forming a CDU, SPD, and Greens coalition, a Kenya coalition it is called. Over the past few weeks, we saw really a very tough debate on the question of immigration, but also on the question of economic policies. Well, there's always room to maneuver, but I'm not sure how those 3 parties would be able to actually sit down and form a coalition government. The left party, is the only party which actually experienced a rise in the polls recently. So they are around 7%, so it's quite likely that they will be represented in the new Bundestag. But they will not be in the position to join any kind of government, because if you look at the progressive camp joining the SPD, the Green, and the Left Party, they won't be able to come over the 50% majority. Well, then you look at the AfD. None of the parties in the Bundestag, although we had a really tough debate on the broken taboo on the question of immigration, where AfD voted in favor of a CDU motion and that got passed, none of the parties represented in the Bundestag will form a government with the AfD. So it is a question for the crystal ball. I really cannot tell you, because we have this really unlikely, this really hard to tell situation that we don't know how many parties will be represented, and thus how many parties will then be able to form actually a government. What we also have new and haven't been talking about so far is that we have a new election law that will also affect the outcome, because we now restricted the number of seats in the government, in the parliament. And this also affects the size of actually the party groups within the government. So there are a lot of question marks and unknowns when it comes to this election. You said AfD. Tell me a little bit more about AfD, and you said that people won't change.
Why do they vote for them?
If I could tell you that, we probably won't have, maybe wouldn't have that problem. But your question is, who is responsible? I think all political parties are responsible for that. It's what we've conducted a lot of research, and we did a lot of focus groups, especially with people from a working background. And what people tell us is that they don't feel represented in the politics anymore, that they don't feel any kind of representation, that they are not seen by politicians, that this is something that they are completely detached from. Politics, for them, is an elite. It's not corrupt, but it's distant, and it's far away, and it does not connect to normal people's life. At least that's a motion that we got from our interviews that we had. And I think overcoming this bridge is a task for all democratic parties. Well, this doesn't explain the 20% and it's doubling from 10% that we had in 2021. I think it comes with a lot of dissatisfaction from the coalition, from the traffic light coalition. It comes with the rise of energy prices, the feeling that all the problems of the world are not just happening far away, but actually they are at my kitchen table. So I have to talk about, how much does bread cost? How much will I be able to make my ends by the end of the week? And this is something that Germans haven't experienced in the last years, because we had a lot of crises, yes, but they were far away. But with the Ukraine war and its effect, we have 1 million refugees from Ukraine in Germany. That changed society, and it really affected them deeply with the question of, well, what is certain still in our world?
Thank you very much. The cliche in the last few years has been that Germany had externalized its energy supply to Russia. It links to China and its security to the United States. Now, this is often said of the European Union as a whole. This is obviously a caricature, it's a massive exaggeration, but there is an element of truth in this, no? Perhaps. Certainly, Judith, you insisted on talking about energy, and I want to come back to energy, if I may. Is there a new energy paradigm available for the German economy? Are they in the process of getting there, or are they muddling through like the rest of us? And before, by the way, we take the high moral ground, let me remind everyone that Spain continues to import massive amounts of Russian gas, by the way.
So thank you for the question. It's not an easy one, but basically I would say that the current energy mix in Germany is based on renewable energies. That's very true. But it also has a very large amount of coal, like more than 20%.
And that's increased in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, from the very moment that nuclear centrals were shut down, I mean that increased, right? So I think that there's a clear bet for renewable energies in Germany, which makes sense. But the problem with this is that it will take time. It will take time because the networks are not ready yet, because there's not enough storage capacity. So it's a matter of time. I mean, it will be there in a few years' time, but the problem is how long this is going to take. So there are different positions by political parties around how to sort out, at least in the short term, the energy problem for the German industry. So what I understand from the Social Democrats and the Greens is that they would be willing to think about public subsidies for the German industry to cover that energy cost differential. However, the Liberals, the CDU, or even Alternative für Deutschland, I think that they're more prone to thinking about reopening nuclear plants. The question is, regarding the latter point, is to what degree this is feasible, right? Because once you have shut down a nuclear plant, you cannot reopen it from one day to the other. You may have even started dismantling it. So is this really a realistic option for the German industry going forward, or do they need to purely rely on public subsidies? If we go for the latter, reliance on public subsidies, then this is very much linked to the debt brake. Are we going to not totally abolish the debt brake, but is Germany going to at least make it a bit more lenient? I know it's embedded in the constitution, but one should be very, I want to be very clear that the German debt brake is way more stringent than EU fiscal rules. EU fiscal rules with which many of us, including Spain, have traditionally not complied with, right? So, the history of enforcement in EU fiscal rules is not a beauty story. But however, for whichever reason, Germany has decided to impose on itself a set of fiscal rules that are way more stringent than EU fiscal rules. Does this make sense? will there be a political majority to change this, or will there be a blocking minority in the Bundestag that will not allow for this to happen?
Thank you. Vuelvo al español porque para...
Let me go back to Spanish, and that way we'll give a bit of a break to our interpreter. You're a federalist. You are someone who has talked about the mutualization of debt and the European project. By the way, I was listening to André, and I was thinking that it would be very interesting to draw a list of differences and similarities between Spanish and German Europeism. Spain is possibly the member state that is more Europeist, more European project supported among the big member states, Spain, Germany, France, etc. And German Europeism is quite interesting because philosophically it's very deep, right? It has to do with the legacy of the Second World War, but at the same time is less federalist, for lack of a better term. The German historically have been very zealous of their sovereignty, and this is something very interesting of Europeism. You can be a great supporter of the European project, but you can want to safeguard your national sovereignty more than us, because I think that in Spain we are not that much attached to national sovereignty, or at least we're willing to share it with the rest of member states. The way things are, is it realistic to think that the EU can make progress in, for instance, implementing the full monetary European Union? We have an internal market that is, by the way, challenged. There's a fragmentation. So are Germany and Spain natural partners in terms of that vision, that European vision? Are they going hand in hand? I think we're quite clear about the fact that we want more integration, which is what's demanded by the geopolitical moment. But Andreas was explaining that Germans are not so clearly positioned in favor of that. What is your position about this dilemma? Well, if we go back to Helmut Kohl and Mitterrand's time, they were saying that you need a political union to have a monetary union. And there's a third party in here, which is important, between our country and Germany, which is France. And it's a key country. And, you know, the political union, or even the fiscal union, or a political union that controls the treasury, the French treasury, that's something that they have never been too keen on, have they? And then, as André said, the German vision is quite legalistic. We have the German Constitutional Tribunal, Constitutional Court saying there is a German order, a European order, some treaties, and treaties say there's a series of competences, but in terms of fiscal aspect, the Union doesn't have competences. Now, during the Euro crisis, Merkel held on to that, to not mutualize debt, and actually said at some point that over her dead body that would happen, right? And one of the most fascinated times as a analyst of Germany in the last 10, 15 years for me was when we were in the pandemic and there were tensions between the Spanish vision and the German vision, and this was reflected on how to tackle that crisis in particular. And by the way, I wrote an article in Politico that I entitled "The Discussion Between Miguel the Galician and Michael the Swiss," trying to represent the Spanish and the German positions, right? And for those two, the concept of solidarity was completely different. It's schizophrenia broken down on a very article, right? Yes, it was in a way. Now, seeing Merkel explain on German TV that the solution for the pandemic was to become more indebted, when for so many years she had said that couldn't be the solution, and she said indebting jointly, which she had said was legally impossible and that morally could be detrimental, negative, or undesirable even. That was a very big twist. The Spanish position is that right now that needs to be mutualized beyond the next generation EU. in order to finance the necessary public goods that are needed in this context, and chiefly common defense. The German position over the course of the last few years has possibly changed, and maybe André already pointed at it. They have become a bit more close to the French. They want to surveil, to become like a normal power, a normalized power within Europe, wanted to safeguard also the national interest, but without taking a leap, without saying, okay, how can I do it so that the EU can help me achieve my national interest? Having the capacity of the state, having the capacity of the country to use the lever of the EU to achieve their national interest. I don't know whether they will go ahead down that road, but I think that it goes in German interest to federalize expenditure for a defense union, which is necessary in a post-liberal world, in a world in which we need to deviate from the protection of the United States and the pressure of the United States. They're saying that they're not going to be there to protect us in the future, and this will cause Germany to have to make a decision. And if I was to place my bets, I would say that ultimately, because we see the Finnish and others saying that we could be talking about mutualizing debt for defense, and I think that Germans will give in to that.
We haven't talked too much about the war, so let's finish these two rounds with your thoughts on two things, really. First of all, having Trump in the White House is really quite traumatic for all of us, but I think in a way it's particularly traumatic for Germany. And the Munich Security Conference over the weekend reflected this. Suddenly, there was an audience full of, well, many Germans, there were people from all over the world, but the German faces in the audience seemed particularly concerned and shocked, I think, in many ways, because you are a pillar of the transatlantic community. So my first question is, how is Germany going to respond to this? I mean, the European Union is basically saying, we need to find new friends and partners. Okay, so that's Canada and New Zealand and Australia, and the list of like-minded democracies is actually quite short, sadly. But still, let's stretch this a little, let's go for India as well, and so on. But that doesn't really solve a lot of the fundamental problems, does it? So that's one question. The second question is Ukraine. Now, there is a real danger that, as we have seen in the last few days, Trump and Putin are going to do a deal which most Ukrainians and I think most Europeans will find totally unacceptable. Because basically they are going to sell them down the river. So 3 years of suffering and death will have really been quite futile. How is Germany going to respond to this? So I'm thinking now more perhaps of Germany as a NATO member. You were quite critical of the Zeitenwende, I think rightly so. And by the way, this raises, if I may, a third issue that I'm concerned about in the Spanish context. As you know, Spain it does not spend much on defense, 1.2% of GDP, and obviously it should spend more, but it's not easy, and this is connected with Zeitenwende, it's not easy to spend more quickly, right? It's very easy to spend a lot of money badly, but it's not easy to spend a lot of money well, because it takes time. And we actually, by the way, the European members of NATO spend about 300 billion euros a year on defense, which is a lot of cash. That's only about a third less than the Americans, so it's 2/3 less. That's a lot of money, but we don't get a lot of bang for our buck. So what's German thinking on this? Okay, do we just buy more F-35s, which, by the way, may be totally useless? I mean, the Italians have put in an order for 80 F-35s. Hopefully that'll keep Trump happy as far as Meloni is concerned. But that doesn't sound like the best or most efficient use of German taxpayers' money. So how do you think you're going to respond to these dilemmas?
Yeah, thank you. It's a conglomeration of very difficult questions. I could talk an hour about that, but I try to keep myself short. First, I want to add something on Miguel. I think when we talk about this question of Europeanisms and federalism, the degree of federalism, maybe a permissive consensus on Europe, which is also changing in Germany slowly, we have to keep one thing in mind we haven't talked about, and this is all very polarized societies, and they're also polarized on the role of international organizations and the EU as such, right? So even in Germany, I do not see among the general public a lot of fondness about mutualization of debt, granting more competencies to international institutions. So this is one thing we should keep in mind. Now on the war and the international situation, you asked me first of all what the Germans or the German political elite thinks about current geopolitical shifts, the rhetoric coming from Washington. You know, the most striking fact is that this doesn't play a role in the election debates at all. Yeah? So Germans like to talk about migration, mostly about the economy, and they do not make the very obvious connection to the international context. This is very worrying, and I see also from the party programs that the parties, the centrist parties, not to speak of the populist parties, they are not prepared for this very profound moment we are now experiencing. I think when it comes to Germany and the war, we have to talk about two things. First of all, I have to remind international audiences again and again about what Germany has been doing, and I'm not agitating here for my government. I'm an expert of an independent institute, yeah. But what Germany has been doing in support of Ukraine, it is really in the lead in Europe. It's massive. If anybody would have told me 3 years ago at this point that we would be sending major battle tanks into a war zone where a European state fights Russia, a major power and a strategic ally of, or strategic partner, not ally, of Germany before 2022 or much more even before 2014, I would have said this is impossible, right? And so Germany is a leading force in supporting Ukraine militarily, economically. Ukrainians couldn't survive. They couldn't even pay their soldiers without European money, right? And we are far away even from the UK as a major military donor in the support. Well, this is one thing. But if you look at strategy, the picture becomes much more blurred. What Chancellor Scholz did in the last 3 years was basically following a German tradition post-1945, or a West German tradition post-1945, in such international conflicts to follow the US lead. Because, at least with President Biden, it was clear that US strategy always kept in mind European interests. So it was a very easy and, in a way, politically cheap strategy, domestically and international, for Germany, although they invested themselves a lot in Ukraine, that at the same time they were always following the non-escalatory US lead. And this put us basically into a difficult position already before Trump took over, but much more after Trump took over. Before Trump took over, it was already pretty clear at the end of last year, during the course of last year, that we had no theory of victory any longer in Ukraine. And after Trump took over, it is entirely unclear what strategy he will follow on Ukraine, whether he will solve this due to a great power sphere of influences logic, would be very bad for us Europeans, or whether Ukrainian sovereignty and the rules-based order play a certain part here, right? And it is also not clear how European interests factor in current Trump strategy. So if I now, what are we doing about this? How do we strategically? I think there is in Berlin, as well as in Brussels and in other capitals, there is still a wait-and-see attitude. How revolutionary will this become, right? And this is a major problem. What we could have at least done already before the inauguration was to come together, to have a plan for peace in Ukraine, somehow kind of aligning with President Zelensky's peace through strength approach, but really hammering out what is the European interest, what are the European red lines, and what can we offer for a potential ceasefire. Second, we could have named a person responsible for communicating this to the allies and eventually joining the negotiation table. You can tell about Trump and his team what you want in excluding now, for the moment, the Europeans. But honestly, who would speak for the Europeans? Would it be Ursula von der Leyen? This is a no-go. She cannot decide on troops. German Chancellor is out of the picture for the moment. Macron, maybe, but he would like this, but he's also somehow weak domestically.
HRVP.
The most likely choice would be Prime Minister Tusk, because he also heads the council so far. But I do not honestly see any movement towards this. And at least the Americans cannot be blamed for this. There's this typical problem: whom do you call in Europe when you want to talk to Europe? Whom do you call? Right? So we are unprepared even in the things we could do at the moment, right? And this is a major problem. So we have to speed that up somehow already during the next weeks in order to be also a legitimate partner. I think, and this is my last point, we have a lot to offer. First of all, because President Trump does not want to pay for the fame he wants to kind of take from those peace negotiations if they succeed at some point. He doesn't want to pay for it, right? Europeans shall pay, they shall send troops, they shall take care of bilateral security guarantees, they shall take care of reconstruction. So this brings us in to a certain degree. What also brings us in are the sanctions. You know, Russians cannot get rid of sanctions without the Europeans. So we have something to bring to the table, but of course, look at the troops issue and what we've seen Monday coming out of this meeting Mr. Macron called. There's no unity here. I mean, in Germany it's also hard. I understand Chancellor Scholz, he cannot go ahead, or it would be stupid by him to go ahead 4 days of the election to promise troops for a war theater, right? Even if it would be maybe policy-wise something I would recommend him. Very last point on how to spend the money. Friedrich Merz has a very, very clear position on that, and I share this from an analyst's point of view. The European Union has the habit of coming up with huge, ambitious programs and talking always about money first, coming up with very huge dimensions of money. I also think that when speaking about the role of the European Union in defense, we first of all have to talk about what can the EU institutions offer us here, what a conglomerate of defense ministers cannot achieve in close cooperation with the industry. And second of all, where do we start? What's the roadmap? And I think Friedrich Merz has offered a very good point here in this Körper speech 2 weeks ago, saying that we first have to talk about simplification, standardization. Two issues. We have a lot of material already, but remember this famous artillery question when the Ukrainians asked us for the 105mm howitzers ammunition, and it turned out that there were 12 different standards all over Europe, right? So we do not have, this is not only a question of money, I would say.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Let's take some questions from the floor. There is a microphone.
Pablo?
Please bear with me because the lighting here is such that... Adelante. Cogemos varias preguntas.
We'll take several questions first. We will gather the questions. Please let us know your name so that the speakers can identify you. My name is Pablo de Ramón Laca, and I'm the executive president of the Spanish SCA.
Okay.
Because it's for the German speakers of the panel. To paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, as you've done earlier, I think there is one comment and one question. Paraphrasing Benjamin Franklin, there are 3 inevitabilities, in my view, in Germany. One's death, the other one's grand coalitions, and the other one's the Bundesverfassungsgericht. So you can't stray too far, ever, from either of those three, for very long. And I think that is worth bearing in mind. And the question is, Scholz's winning slogan in 2021 was kann Kanzlerin. He can act as the female chancellor. He was the direct heir of Angela Merkel. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that is salvageable now about Merkel's legacy? 16 years in power. Thank you.
Okay, so Merkel's legacy, I think that's probably one, well, for both of you. Sí, adelante, por favor. Si se puede identificar.
If you could please identify yourself. Hello, good day. I'm Germán Buceta, and I'm a consultant on public affairs and Spanish-German relationships. Thank you very much.
Haré mi pregunta en
Thank you very much. And I will ask my question in Spanish. It's for Miguel and Judith. I want to talk about elections in Germany. What is at stake for Spain? Going back to the title of the conference, can the Spanish government, led by Sanchez, become an ally of the new government in Germany, probably led by Mr. Merz, focusing on things such as, for instance, European leadership / Ukraine / defense, migration, economy, energy? Good question. Okay, so we have Merkel, we have her legacy, and the Spanish-German relationships with the outcoming government. More questions? Thank you. My name is Jimena Espina, and my question is, you were talking about refugees before, and how we've seen that the different parties have currently taken on this subject matter. They have broken the taboo, as you mentioned before. So there is a green taboo, we think, also. So what role does that taboo play in the green proposal or the energy proposal? The Merkel legacy first. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Merkel legacy. Well, when you compare this election campaign to the last election campaign, you don't see hardly any similarities, first of all. This uprising that Olaf Scholz had by the end of the last election campaign was due to the fact that people then realized, well, Merkel will be gone, really? She's not there. Yeah, she won't be there anymore in office, and they were questioning themselves. Well, what are my options, and who do I actually want to see as her successor? Laschet, the CDU candidate back then, well, he did some horrible mistakes, and then his popularity ratings, they began to really, really fall. But Scholz, he was on a wave, yes, absolutely. And he also tried to win Merkel voters by the way that he was presenting himself. If you vote for me, I will bring you stability. Nothing will change. And although you said before people want change, I think, yes, in the way that politics is done, people want change. But when it comes to their ordinary life, people do not want any kind of change. They just want pure stability. Merkel's legacy when it comes to topics and what she has achieved as German politician, I'm just observing. I'm not part of the CDU, so this is just what I can tell you from looking at what they've been about their internal debates. What I see is that the current CDU under Merz has distanced itself when it comes to quite a number of topics from the Merkel CDU. It has become quite more conservative, where Merkel moved the CDU quite to the center. Well, they were always in the center, but she opened it to left voters, or social democratic voters, who were also more conservative leaning. and Merz moved back. And that is quite reasonable when you look at what German society is thinking right now, because we have a very conservative mainstream situation right now, I would say. We have moved into that direction. We had one very interesting intervention, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, when it came to the question of this motion that was passed in the German Bundestag, a non-binding motion on much stricter migration rules, and the AfD voted in favor of that, and that got passed. But in the 2 days later, when it was up to vote for actually a law, that actually did not pass. In that brief period of 2 days, Merkel intervened publicly, and she has been very restrictive with any kind of political interventions in the public. And she said, well, that's a wrong move, to bring in a motion that would be clearly only gain the majority by the AfD vote. And that was something I think she did on a very personal issue to defend her kind of legacy.
Thank you. André.
Yeah, maybe both on the question regarding Angela Merkel's legacy and the green, so the backlash against green policies in Germany. The Merkel legacy, I think, it's always, there is a lot of critique now. We really have a kind of, especially among conservatives, a strong anti-Merkel movement, if you want so. But I would say it's always easier to have a benefit of hindsight discussion. You know, you have to look really in order to analyze policy and why policy was formulated and enacted this or that way. You have to focus on the moment where decisions were taken. Yeah? For example, on migration, 2015, this influx of over 1 million people, mostly Syrians and Afghans, she's mostly criticized now from the conservative spectrum. But if you look at the time, she only had bad choices, right? It was clear that opening the borders would maybe lead to a radical right-wing backlash, the AfD, but not doing it would have also brought us in miscredit with our international partners. The public at that time was mostly in favor of a very friendly, welcoming approach. Well, we learned from that later. Yeah? It led to an uncontrolled refugee policy, but you have to analyze things looking at the time. What I think is a very interesting example is the critique now of the decision to drive forward Nord Stream 2 together with the Russians, which obviously now, with a benefit of hindsight, opened the way to geopolitical confrontation between Russia and Europe, finally. And here I really have to go back to my cultural argument, you know. And I'm really convinced that this is the most convincing explanation here for why this project wasn't even put on hold after 2014. This is the very strong West German tradition of the trading state. You can drive forward economic projects regardless of any strategic consequences, right? Because the strategic consequences for the last decades were always borne by others and not by ourselves. We deeply, especially West German elites, were deeply internalizing this trading state focus. Strategic considerations just slipped their minds, right? And this problem exists even right now. What the problem really was, also not really with the benefit of hindsight, this is the exclusion here, I would say, is the issue of domestic reforms. This is really an area where we see that Merkel has left us a very tough legacy. She was de-investing. She was a star on the international level, solving very tough crises, but domestically it was difficult. Question is why? Was it because of a lack of incentive as a chancellor, or does here really come into play what Miguel called the deep distrust, what we now see in the functioning of the German state? We have a huge problem with the so-called Politikverflechtungsfalle. So that obviously decisions land up somewhere in between the European, the federal, the strong regional levels in Germany. No one knows who's responsible for what, and so on and so forth. So it's hard, obviously, to enact reforms in Germany. And on the Greens, you know, I mean, we haven't spoken much about them and about the whole climate agenda of the last 3 years and what this did to the German political spectrum. But I think it's very obvious, and it all crystallizes for the Greens in this so-called heating systems law, you know. I mean, in a way, if you look at all the party programs even right now, this is still by far the most progressive party, right? And I always found it interesting that the critique of them and against climate change policies, has always crystallized in this very small heating systems law. I mean, it had a profound impact, especially on East Germans at the time, but overall, it's not such a big issue. But they were hammered from the very beginning. Basically, the green rise and the bigger green role in this coalition was over. After this law on the heating systems failed. So this much for progressive thinking among Germans.
Thank you very much. Vamos a acabar en español hablando de la relación.
Let's finish in Spanish, talking about the Spanish and German relationships. The question was addressed to you, Miguel and Judith, the question of whether Spain and Germany will be able to do things together in the common German political cycle, be it in the economic sphere at the European level, in the geopolitical sphere, in relationship to the war. Both countries adopted a common position in Monday in the Paris meeting with Macron. Together with Poland, they said that they don't consider the possibility of deploying troops to keep the peace, supposedly, after an agreement is reached. Well, maybe that would be the beginning of a common understanding. Well, very briefly, because I know we're running out of time. I think that there could be a bit of a lack of synchronicity in terms of political colors. Roughly, I would say that in the last decade, or even more than that, the political party, the political color in power in the German government more or less matched the color of the political party in power at La Moncloa, in power in Spain. The relationship between Pedro Sánchez and Olaf Scholz was extraordinary. And something exceptional was the presence of our president in German Council of Ministers. Now, the question is whether the smooth relationship will remain if we have different or opposing political colors. We have a coalition social democratic coalition government. They will also have a coalition government, but the Christian Democrats will be leading that. I hope that there will be collaboration. It's rather wishful thinking, perhaps, and it's a very structural democracy. Also, in the time of Felipe González, there were very good friendships in there. Well, in the last few years, there's been efforts to institutionalize all this and not just focus on the leaders. There was a time in which bilateral relationships between countries were left on the trenches. Everybody met around Brussels. We just had to travel to Brussels, and maybe the relationship between heads of states and at the technical that was dissolved in a way. And in a way, this has been re-encouraged. An action plan, which is all-encompassing with many industries and many areas engaged with that. And I think that will remain. And the role of Spain ultimately is important in this context because I think right now there's quite a bit of admiration amongst Germans towards Spain. Spain is growing above average, is a country that supports the European project. In the context of the Ukraine, we have also been supportive, I think, in a way. So for Germany and for France, Spain is a country that is important because sometimes Germans and French are a bit distant, and Spain Spain can have a mediating role, and that's going to be key. If Germany and France are slightly weaker, someone like Spain, let's see what happens going forward, but right now Spain is economically better positioned than they are, and from the economic standpoint, they're quite clear about the direction in which the EU should go. So maybe something that's missing. But the way Germany and Spain are quite similar in the sense that there's not that strategic culture, that Zeitenwende that Germany still needs, is something that Spain also needs. So if we compare this to the more consolidated French vision, I think that Germany and Spain can meet halfway. They can consider even jointly what they could contribute to that end. Well, thank you very much. We have had Spanish-German precision, and it's 1:30, and we are going to wrap up on time, as I said an hour and a half ago. Thank you so very much to our speakers. Thank you for your presence and your contributions. Thank you very much to you all, and I hope to see you in the next meeting that we will hold here, and we will be talking about the new coalition government in Germany, maybe around spring. Hopefully we won't have to wait too long before we see that happening, because frankly, we cannot afford the luxury of not having a German government for too long. Thank you very much, everybody.